Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. My name's Andy Taylor. I'm the head of strategy for Cubic Transportation Systems. And currently I find myself in Pennsylvania. This morning I've been at the Pennsylvania Transportation Summit, where the conversation has been purely focused on the amount of infrastructure grants which are available, but also the complexity and trying to understand the methodology, the process, and what can counties and cities and states actually go after. It's a complex scenario. That's why we've got Audrey and Jason here today to sort of explore how we can go about securing IIJA funds for transportation innovation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Audrey.
Hi, everybody. Thank you guys so much for joining us this morning or afternoon or wherever you are. We're really excited for this conversation about federal grants and all of the opportunity for transportation innovation that comes from IIJA. My name is Audrey Denis. I'm a strategy manager for Cubic Transportation Systems and work closely on a lot of the questions of grants and how grants and federal dollars can help to support future mobility systems that are more efficient, more sustainable, and more accessible to everyone. And with me today, I have Jason Pavlicek. So Jason, I'll hand it over to you to introduce yourself.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jason Pavlicek. I help work with Cubic. I have been a 20-year plus veteran of federal transportation policy, advocacy, and business development, and look forward to jumping in on this monumental piece of legislation and the opportunities that arise from it.
Awesome. So a quick agenda for what we're planning to go through today. We're going to give a quick overview of IIJA to give sort of the 10,000-foot view, and then start to dig in on the reauthorized FHWA programs, the new FHWA formula grants, renewed competitive grants, new competitive grants, transit overview, as well as next steps and what it all means. And this session is being recorded, so the information should be available after the session as well. So Jason, I will hand it over to you to do a quick overview of IIJA.
Thanks a lot, Audrey. And just by way of background and introduction, there are several names for this legislation. And I think some of the confusion that comes with this massive piece of legislation really is sort of the, what's in a name. The official legislation title is IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It's also known as, and is being coined as, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. So really what we're talking about here is that legislation. It passed Congress and was signed by the president late last year. And in many ways, this legislation is 15, 20 years in the making. It's been since the late 1990s that we've had sort of a cornerstone piece of legislation that changed the way we look at infrastructure and the way we fund infrastructure at the federal level. And in many ways, this was 20 years in the making and historic, generational, throw all the adjectives you want at it. But it certainly is, in many ways, a real opportunity for us as a country to improve our transportation system and our infrastructure. At a high level, what I'll note is the significant increase in funding that will be going to transportation, specifically surface transportation, over the next several years. The package itself includes a wide array of surface transportation opportunities: rail, transit, highways, aviation, water infrastructure, broadband. What we're going to focus on today is really what is commonly known as a reauthorization. For those of you who follow transportation policy, the federal transportation bill is reauthorized about once every 5 or 6 years. And what happened in this process is that a reauthorization of the federal transportation policy was sort of folded into this broader infrastructure package. So hopefully that dispels any confusion or clarifies, I think, with the legislation itself. And I bring it up largely because I think how it came together, the process by which it came together, and the mechanics behind it and the politics behind it really helped to shape what the legislation is and what the opportunities are. First, I want to speak to some of the policy areas of the legislation. Where this legislation, I think, begins to turn the corner in terms of a federal policy is that for many, many years, our nation's infrastructure policy, our nation's transportation policy was an infrastructure policy. We build bridges, we buy buses. It is very much capitally focused, asset focused. That continues to be the case in most ways. But what we're beginning to see is how transportation and policies, recognizing how transportation affects our daily lives, how equity plays a role, or transportation plays a role in equity, the role of transportation in carbon reduction, sustainability. So these are themes that are sort of fleshed out in this legislation. And unlike previous transportation policy bills and reauthorizations, where policy itself is written and states change the way they do things, or the federal funding is altered to accommodate certain policies, what we find in this bill is that the way the process was put together and the way the sausage was made, for lack of better words, is that some of these themes that we're talking about manifest themselves through direct federal investment, through direct federal spending. So you will see, and as we go through this afternoon's presentation, that there's a lot of new opportunities through competitive grants, also known as discretionary grants, that are open to a wide variety of stakeholders. Prior to the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, a vast majority of federal transportation funding went through a formula, and that money went to one of two stakeholders. On the highway side, it went to state DOTs. On the transit side, it went to designated recipients. That remains the case with a lot of the formula money, but what we hear today is new opportunities for local governments, county governments, transit agencies to address specific issues. So with that, let's just go ahead and dive right into it.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. And I think one area that's particularly interesting is sort of this focus on sustainability and the transition from infrastructure to really thinking about how we make the network work better. And I think that when we're talking about sustainability, in order to reach one of those sustainability goals, this investment can't be solely for expanding roads and pouring tar. It really has to be thinking about how do we make the system more efficient? How do we make it easier for people to include transit and multimodalism in how they're moving in a way that helps to sort of underscore some of those equity and sustainability goals.
Absolutely.
I think the first thing we wanted to start with is the Reauthorized FHWA formula programs.
Yeah, I just want to sort of highlight some of the programs that were reauthorized. As I mentioned, the legislation created a lot of new opportunities, but we'd be remiss to not talk about some of the expanded opportunities and some of the programs that were impacted by the legislation. And I'll start with the all too famous Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Program, CMAQ. CMAQ, of all the federal programs, actually saw the lowest or the least growth in terms of formula programs. And I'll get into that why in a minute. But CMAQ still grows 10%. It's authorized at $13.2 billion over 5 years. A handful of changes were made to the process and to the CMAQ program. Like we've seen in the previous reauthorizations and the FAST Act and the legislation before it, new eligibilities were added to CMAQ. In this case, there are two, I think, that are of note. One is the concept of micromobility, as it's so called, shared scooters, shared bikes, different types of shared use mobility items that allow people to get that first last mile and connect where transit cannot. Those projects are now eligible, as well as a number of zero emission vehicles, heavy fleet zero emission vehicles, primarily aimed at cleaning up ports and port facilities. But also one of the big changes is that you can now use CMAQ dollars for operating costs in perpetuity. Prior to this legislation, there was a limitation of 3 years and really 5 years on how you could use CMAQ money to fund transit operations. That has now been removed. So as long as a project that you fund CMAQ with continues to show carbon or continues to show air quality reductions and air quality improvements through VMT reduction, et cetera, then you can use CMAQ dollars for a project in perpetuity. Again, as long as they're showing where there's a continued air quality improvement. One thing I will note is that CMAQ has as I mentioned, a very wide, at least now it does, a relatively wide list of eligibilities. Only thing you can't really do with CMAQ money is build roads and build single occupancy vehicle roads. But you can do everything from adaptive traffic management, fare collection upgrades and modernization, mobility as a service type projects. You see the list there, but CMAQ itself grows. And I bring this up largely because one of the important parts of this legislation is that, again, we'll talk about the grant opportunities, but within the formula programs, as these core programs grow, state DOTs and regional metropolitan planning organizations that are charged with deciding what to use the money for now have more money to spend. And when you look at federal transportation spending, usually a state or an MPO or what have you will look out 4 years and they will effectively write a plan, also known as a TIP, in terms of how they're going to spend their federal money. So all previous plans, all previous TIPs account for a certain baseline of funding. And now that there's that additional 10% on top, there's an opportunity for states and MPOs to go back to the plans they have and rethink about what they want to add. Again, with CMAQ, it's 10%. It's not a ton, but it is a pretty decent amount. Moving on to the next program, very briefly, the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. You see here a much larger increase in spending, 24%. And again, the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program is a formula program that is effectively shared or divided between regional governments, MPOs deciding projects, and state DOTs. 55% of the program is suballocated to local governments through their MPO, and the remaining dollar goes to the state. Again, opportunity here where there's more money for MTOs to do what's known as program. So if there are things that you as a municipal government want to see done or want to change to your transportation system, now's a good time to talk to your MPO and see what their process will be to spend that money. Same thing with state DOTs. They will also have to figure out what to do with this money. Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, again, is a formula program. It is a very, very, very all-inclusive program. It has in many ways the most flexibility. You can do everything from ITS to TDM to funding transit, building roads. It is the flexible catch-all, for lack of better words, program within the federal highway program. And again, 55% of it goes to suballocated to MPOs. The other 45 goes to states. One thing I want to mention here is that the legislation here did create a fourth population tier. Without getting into too many details about the STP program, the larger metro region is, the more authority and autonomy it has, in theory, in selecting projects for the STP program. What they did is they created a fourth tier with population regions with population between 50 and 200,000, where those sort of mini cities, mini towns have metro regions now have more authority than they had before. Previously, the state really sort of controlled how to spend the STP money in those regions. Now it has to be done in collaboration with those local governments and those regional MPOs. A couple of things changed here. Certainly added some eligibilities related to wildlife crossings, resilience, electric vehicle charging, just things that are sort of becoming more relevant in transportation space. But again, the big thing here is STP increased by 24%.
Thanks, Jason. And then just a quick note for everybody that I forgot to mention is that there's a Q&A at the end. So if anybody has questions, please go ahead and list those in the Q&A box, and we will save some time at the end to go through that. So then, Jason, the federal match.
Yeah, very briefly, one thing I want to add here is most federal highway programs, when you fund a project, there's a local match required. So if a project costs $1, and don't we wish they all cost $1? If a project costs $1, then the federal government federal money could be used to pay up to 80 cents on that dollar, And then the other 20 cents had to come from state or local tax revenue or some type of non-federal source. There are a handful of projects, and I want to highlight this because I think it's often overlooked. And one of the big challenges that we're going to see from this legislation is that while there's a significant increase in federal money, that federal money has to be matched with local money. So talking to a lot of communities lately, there's been a lot of concerns of, well, where are we going to get local match? How are we going to match these programs? I just will note that there's a variety of programs, including traffic control signalization, a number of safety programs, commuter carpooling, vanpooling, traffic signs, etc., that are and can be funded at 100%, meaning no local match is required. So if certainly if you were thinking about doing a regional traffic management system with stoplights, you can fund that entirely with federal dollars. So I just want to sort of plant that seed and put that pin out there that there are some exceptions to the rule of 80-20.
Awesome. And then I think that there are some new formula programs that we wanted to talk about from FHWA.
Just a handful, just a couple $1 billion worth. As I mentioned before, the federal transportation program prior to this legislation, there were a small handful of discretionary grant programs. The most famous, of course, was called Tiger. It was called Tiger, it was called Raise, it was called Build. They all sort of had, depending on the president at the time, they were given different names, but effectively, that was really the competitive grant program that was made available from DOT. That is no longer the case. And I bring that up, and I will cover Tiger in a minute, or what's now called Raise. I bring that up to largely say that a lot of communities have always shied away from applying for grants. The thought process being that it takes time to submit a grant. It takes time to put things together. And that when there are, $100 million of projects being submitted for $20 million of available funding, your odds of being selected are not great. That has always been sort of the mantra and some of the themes that I've heard about. That is really no longer the case. There are now, again, over $100 billion worth of federal discretionary grant programs. So instead of having to have 500 agencies apply for Build or Tiger, you now have a lot of new programs, many of which have a particular focus area. I think that does two things. One, it allows for local governments, especially smaller local governments, to feel confident that they've got a good chance of winning. Again, there's still going to be competition, and it's not going to be, where there's $20 million available and there are $25 million projects submitted. But at the same time, it's not going to be a 20-to-1 ratio of projects submitted versus projects money available. And also with the wide variety of money, some of those more competitive programs will begin to see less money being submitted for them because there's other opportunities. So I think that's one thing that's incredibly important to understand is that if you're one of those cities that have sort of sat out some of these competitions because woe is me, how is Wilsonville, fill in the blank state, going to ever compete against New York City? Well, now there are programs specifically designed for you to compete, and there's enough programs out there where, for lack of better words, money shouldn't be a problem anymore. If you want funding and if you have a project, funding shouldn't be a problem. So let me just dive right into it. One of the new, and this is a formula program, I should probably start out by saying that. I jumped the gun here a little bit, but one of the new formula programs here is the carbon reduction program. As I mentioned earlier, CMAQ only grew by 10%, and part of that is because there's a creation of this new carbon reduction program that is a relatively very small set of eligible projects that are focused on ITS, active transportation, electrification, and TDM. So that is a formula program where 65% of the funding will be sub-allocated to MPOs, regional governments over 200,000. This new program is a really, really great opportunity to engage in a variety of activities to effectively, again, reduce carbon from our transportation system. ITS being an eligible, obviously, an eligible project. What we expect, and one of the elements of this legislation is that within 2 years, every state must develop a carbon reduction plan. Now, as I mentioned earlier, 65% of that money will be sub-allocated to MPOs, and 35 will be retained by the state to spend money. But the state is the one who has to develop a plan. One recommendation that I'm making to a lot of the MPOs that I've been talking to is you should be developing a plan or adapting plans that you have, and many MPOs have some type of carbon reduction or air quality plan, adapting those plans to then be merged into what your state is providing. But the first 2 years of this program will sort of be a little bit of the wild, wild west where there is no plan in place at many state levels. So the eligible projects are here in the slide, but this is a real opportunity, I think, to have municipal governments address congestion, carbon reduction, VMT reduction. And again, it's a $6.4 billion program over 5 years. So certainly not a small amount of money, a significant amount of money that, again, intended to go towards local governments, towards municipal governments to address the impact of carbon in our transportation system.
Awesome. And I think a good way to start kind of tying together some of the puzzle pieces or the different modes that come into our conversations around congestion. So how do we think about mode shift and multimodal journeys and making that easier for people, as well as making sure that people are safe when they choose active modes like pedestrians and bicyclists.
Absolutely. And one of the I think the fundamental parts of this legislation, as you'll see, is that there was enough funding included in this bill. The goal of Congress, and effectively what is and what will be demonstrated, the goal of USDOT is to have regions look at developing, as you mentioned, all the pieces of the puzzle. Previously, funding was made available and a lot of times for entities to buy a piece of the puzzle. Let me buy variable message signs that let me know that remind me that I am stuck in traffic. But what this money is intended to be used for is to get that note to me, not while I'm sitting in my car stuck in traffic, but when I'm at home so I can make a change if I don't want to sit in traffic for 2 hours. And then also make a change to perhaps bus routes where we need to add a bus to an area that has increased demand at the time because of an event or because of whatever the reason may be. So again, I think what you're going to see through not only this carbon reduction program, but also from some of the grant programs is Congress is very interested in seeing regional governments and state DOTs put pieces of the puzzle together so they work together so that we have a more collectively built and operated transportation system.
So I think to step through some of the renewed competitive grants, I know you mentioned this raise one earlier, so sort of diving into some of the additional funding that's available there.
Yeah, there's a handful of programs that were reauthorized. As I mentioned previously, the largest grant program available was RAISE. It was formerly called BUILD, and before that, originally called TIGER. This stems from the 2008 stimulus package, but it's actually authorized. It's a real program. It has a set amount of funding every year. There is the opportunity, and Congress does have the option of adding more money to the RAISE program. But this is your catch-all large capital investment program, intersections, freeways, the whole 9 yards. One of the things that I will mention, I think that is important for local governments and any entity to know is that DOT is definitely, and their notice of funding availability was put out a few weeks ago. The first round of RAISE grants are due, I believe, in a month and a half, 2 months. But one of the things that I think is important to sort of recognize is that everyone and their brother, everyone and their sister wants to build a road, wants to repair an intersection, wants to rebuild a bridge, what have you. But what DOT is looking for, again, is how to make that process more seamless and more integrated. So I like to call it putting ornaments on the tree. Previously, there was a general notion that if I have to add cost to a project by including synchronized lights along a corridor or some type of transit service along a congested corridor of a road that I'm fixing, that all I'm doing is adding costs and will make it less competitive. That's actually not the case now. What Congress and what DOT is looking for is that as you're putting your grant applications in, think about it not just from the project itself, but the entire region and the entire corridor. So that if you are rebuilding a bridge or wanting to add a lane mile, think about adding elements of ITS elements into it, or some transit or TDM elements into it, so that when you're submitting a grant, you're looking at a holistic sort of solution to congestion along a corridor. Those are the things that Congress are going to be looking for, DOT is going to be looking for through the RAISE program, the infra program, which I'll talk about in a moment here, and also a program that is newly created called mega projects. So if you walk away from anything, if you're submitting a RAISE grant or you're thinking about it, or if you're an entity that would like to see your city, county, state add an element to a project that they're already thinking about, recognize that those added ornaments are a value added, not a detraction. And it's something that DOT is going to be looking for. So strongly urge anyone looking to apply for those grants to think about that and think about how to take effectively what is a very bland, road paving project and turn it into a holistic solution.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. I think that's a really good tip for sort of standing apart. All right. So now go ahead.
Infra. And same goes here. Infra is reauthorized. It was a part of the FAST Act. It is a more freight focused program where build and raise are focused on sort of a catch-all projects of significance. Infra is really focused on freight movement. Obviously, moving vehicles, passenger vehicles out of the way can help with freight. So that is recognized in both the underlying legislation as well as what will be the notice of funding availability. But the goal of infra is really to help freight move better. And again, it is multimodal. And again, it's a situation where they are going to be looking for, it's, more than just simply, building a road or what have you. They're going to be looking for elements that are also added through to again, make that freight movement more seamless. So things to think about as you're looking to submit a project.
Yeah, thinking about kind of congestion management, how to do that in a more efficient way that also sort of helps keep those national arteries of freight moving through the country.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then the third sort of taking a little bit of a turn here, the third program that was reauthorized is the ATC MTD program. It changed their name. I was involved in the creation of this program originally in the FAST Act. It was originally going to be called Smart Cities, but when this legislation was created originally, there was, if you recall, the original Smart Cities program that eventually was won by Columbus. So within like 12 hours, the name itself had to be changed. I did not pick ATC MTD, nor did I have anything to do with or support the new name of the program, which is the Advanced Transportation Technology and Innovative Mobility Program. But long story short, this is a new program funded from the ITS office of US DOT, again, with the focus on putting pieces of the puzzle together from an ITS perspective. Everything from rewards and incentives, congestion management, signal priorities, mobility as a service. This is sort of your innovation catch-all program. And we expect the funding to be made available later this spring. One of the things I will notice is that unlike other programs that are generally 80% federal, 20% local, because these programs have a little bit more, can have a little bit more risk involved because they often involve new innovative projects, the federal share is 50-50. So if your project is $12 million, $6 million federal has to be matched with $6 million local. One of the things I will mention about this program and the match itself is that match can be in what's called soft match. So in the form of engineering time, time that your team may put in. It doesn't have to necessarily be, in this case, in the form of actual cash. It can come in a variety of different forms. So just to kind of put plant that seed. I'm going to be planting a lot of seeds today, so just get used to me saying that. But that's something to sort of consider and think about.
I think that's another good tip for us to take home in addition to the ornaments on the tree, is also thinking about where there's kind of some opportunity to provide the soft match or sort of ways to use sort of creative methods for that local match.
Audrey, if nothing else, I've got a bad metaphor for every one of these slides.
I love it. All right, new competitive grants.
Yeah, and we'll come through these relatively quickly because again, there's a handful of them. But certainly, I think what I hope I leave you with is that And it's something that I mentioned at the onset is if you have a hope and a transportation hope and a dream, a hope and a project, there's funding for you, and it comes in a variety of sources, whether it's the formula programs we talked about, competitive grant programs. There is sort of a flavor of ice cream for everyone, sticking to my promise of a bad metaphor. But the congestion relief program is intended to build off of, actually, the intent is to build off of a very old program initiated by the Bush administration, related to, at the time, was the congestion management program. For those of you who are as old as I am, you remember the 4Ts: transit technology, telework, and tolling. That's really what the congestion relief program is, looking at some of the benefits of that old program, and realizing them again, and refocusing it really on tolling. I'm sorry, on not tolling, on technology. The congestion relief program is a competitive grant program, $50 million a year. It is only open to areas, to regions over 1 million in population. The minimum grant size, again, is 10 million. The goal there being, again, they don't want to fund a project. They want to fund a series of projects and have cities and local governments come to them with a variety of solutions tied together. One of the things that I will mention here in this entity is that, again, while only metropolitan areas of over 1 million are eligible, that doesn't mean the city itself has to be over 1 million. So looking at, for example, the Dallas-Fort Worth region, the city of Arlington, which does not have 1 million people, but because it's in the larger metro area, the city of Arlington could put together an application. So as long as your city or town or county are in a metropolitan region of over 1 million, you can apply. Although I will mention, I will note that what Congress intended for and what we expect DOT to be looking for are regional solutions. So this is an opportunity to create regional congestion management, anything from a region-wide signal program to a pricing and incentive program for vehicles. There's a lot of opportunity to be creative with this program. Again, within this program, construction of roads is not eligible, but again, it does allow for a variety of other ITS TDM pricing type projects to reduce congestion. So certainly looking forward to this program being noticed probably this summer.
Awesome. Yeah, I think for a bunch of these new programs, they were announced with their high level funding, but we're still kind of waiting for exactly what the timeline for some of them will be. So definitely staying tuned for the summer to see a little bit more details and for these funding to come out.
And with all of these competitive grants, we expect them to be, there's a tentative timeline that the White House has put out. It's already behind. It got put out about 3 weeks ago. I think they're already behind schedule, which is to be understood and expected. But many of these programs will be unveiled in sequence and order over the course of the next few weeks as well. So moving on to the Smart Grants program, this is taking, again, the Smart Cities program that I spoke about a little while ago, that eventually went to Columbus, and doing an annual competition. This is $500 million, so about $100 million a year. The way they've made this program is that they've created sort of three pots of money. 40% will go to cities and regions over 400,000. 30% will go to middle-sized communities of between 50,000 and 400,000, and then 30% will go to rural communities or regional partnerships of rural communities. Again, this is an ITS-focused program, looking at automated and connected vehicles, looking at created and regional intelligent systems, smart cities. So you look here again, the eligibility of projects is very much focused on ITS and technology installation, less so on active transportation or any type of program that specifically incentivizes people to change mode. This is really a technology focused type program. So again, looking at, if you think about the old Smart Cities program, this is what this program is. Again, separate program from some of the other ones we talked about. You'll notice a theme here where there are many programs that have relatively similar themes, relatively similar eligibilities, but they all have their little spin. So again, ample opportunity for cities and local governments to look at funding.
Definitely. And I think that as you're kind of looking at the different grants and where programs might slot in the best, just thinking about what those sort of slight nuanced differences are and how you kind of tell a story that sort of speaks to the goal of the grant. So Jason, our Safe Streets and Roads for All program, which I know is an exciting new program for Vision Zero.
Absolutely. There's a policy and a concept known as Vision Zero, and that's a philosophy, a plan, a process where local governments develop plans or programs to look at eliminating fatalities and improving safety, and with a real focus on bicycle and pedestrian safety. The Safe Streets and Roads for All program is created as a way to encourage local governments, regional governments to develop Vision Zero plans and then implement them. This is a $5 billion program, so $1 billion a year, a significant amount of funding. Some of the money can be used for the development of Vision Zero plans, and then from those Vision Zero plans, a vast majority of the funding, about 60% of the funding at least, is made available to implement Vision Zero plans. So if your city has a Vision Zero plan, you can use this pot of money to go ahead and get funding for it. And if you do not have a Vision Zero plan, or a plan that takes into account your local government's safety, including bicycles and pedestrian, this money can again be used to develop those plans, and then money can also be used to implement them. I will note that there's a large focus on active transportation, but one of the things that I want to focus on here is that better intersections and better safety at intersections is eligible. So if you want to improve your safety lights and make them adaptive to pedestrians, and many of the advances there that Audrey, I'm sure we'll talk about here in a little bit. This is an eligible program pot for those projects.
Great. As an avid walker and biker, I'm excited for this one.
Absolutely. So the cousin, the family member, however you want to relate it to, the congestion management program, where again only $1 million or higher can apply to, is the Rural Surface Transportation Grant Program. This is what it sounds like. It's $2 billion over 5 years. The first year will be $300 million for rural areas. A real focus of this legislation is accessibility, as well as creating new access. At least 90% of the funds, or 90% of the funds, go to sort of large capital projects. It can be large ITS projects too. But the grant size, the minimum is $25 million. So that means the overall project itself has to be closer to 30 billion at least. So this is a program that is, again, designed to create rural accessibility and connectivity, with a real focus on larger capital projects that require more funding. There is a 10% set aside for smaller programs and projects, microtransit type projects, commuter type projects that connect rural individuals to jobs. So there is a small set of money that is set aside for projects that are not $25 million. But again, a 90% of this program is designed for larger capital type projects. And again, I emphasize that building a road to connect people is great. Building a smart road is better. And that's what USDOT be looking for. And again, if you have a road that perhaps isn't smart but needs some safety upgrades, adding some ITS type elements, again, will only improve your chances of being selected. So the final new competitive grant program on the highway side that I want to mention, and I'll do it very briefly, is the Strategic Innovation for Revenue Collection Program. This is a evolved version of a program called STS-FA. I'm not going to tell you what all those things are because I forget for the most part. But this evolves from the value pricing program. And effectively what this program is designed to do is to look at innovative ways to collect revenue from the system itself, beyond just simply the gas tax. So some of the previous iterations of this program helped to create pay-as-you-drive insurance, what we effectively know now as hot lanes. It also provides sort of the ability to seed and fund road user charging projects, but it's not only focused on road user charging. There have been a handful of innovative projects funded for this program that look at beyond just simply road user charging. I've seen projects that look at monetizing intersections, and things of that nature. So certainly creative ways to look at generating revenue from the transportation system that go beyond the gas tax. Previous versions of this legislation or this program were focused on providing funding to states. One of the things I'll mention here is that while this programming is about the same size as it's always been, $75 million, about $15 million a year, anyone in the local government realm can apply for funding for this. States, MPOs, local governments. So that's really the new facet of this bill. And again, it looks at the test, acceptance, design, implementation, security, privacy of public acceptance of new revenue generating programs. So if your region is thinking about some type of congestion pricing, road user charging, what have you, this might be a good pot of money to look at applying for to sort of test some of the ideas that you have.
Awesome. Yeah, I think this is a good one because I know there's a lot of question marks around implementing road user charging and how to do it in a way that is sort of supportive of congestion goals. So very exciting that there's kind of some set aside money to do pilots and to really dig into that.
Absolutely. And I'll close federal highways by just simply saying there's a handful of programs we haven't talked about. Most of them are smaller. Most of them are more focused on very specific details. And again, we could probably spend 3 days talking about this bill and not be done. It's 2,700 pages, 2,704 actually. But certainly some things we should mention is that there is an open research program, the University Transportation Center program, which often partners with public and private sector entities, was reauthorized at $100 million a year. And then on the transit side, one of the important things, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, is that generally speaking, transit research funds, which have funded projects such as the Mobility on Demand, Sandbox, fare collection projects, and innovation programs, that funding is now guaranteed. Previously, federal transit research funding was subject to annual appropriations, meaning that there was a target number that Congress set, but each year Congress would have to weigh transit research funding with housing vouchers and other programs. But now the transit research funding is guaranteed. They know how much they're going to be getting, which will allow them to create longer term programs and projects, which I think is very, very important to many of us. Speaking of transit, I think we're going to dive right in. And the good news and bad news about transit is that it received a significant amount of funding, about a 63% increase, depending on what level you consider a baseline, and everyone has a different level. So sticking to a growth is not, a percentage increase is not good per se. Everyone argues. I will simply say there's a lot more money in transit than there was yesterday. I think quite frankly, between the COVID money and this funding, more money has been allocated for transit in the last 3 years than the last 20 combined. And I haven't done the math on yet, but I'm fairly confident it's going to be pretty close. You see a significant increase in the formula programs. One of the things I will mention about how this bill came together is that the transit title never came together. Long story short, many elements of the highway title and the safety title had already been negotiated before this package was put together. The transit pieces were never really gelled. Chairman Brown of Ohio and ranking member Toomey from Pennsylvania never really got to a point of agreement on major policy issues. So instead, they agreed to disagree, set a top line number, and really just funded what was existing. So we don't see very many new initiatives or very much new policy in the transit title. We just see more money. The one exception is, in many ways, electrification of buses, and we'll go ahead and dive right into that, and we can go through this relatively quickly. Bus facility, which is the annual grant program for transit agencies to buy new buses. Obviously, they have their formula money and they have their formula money, but the bus facility program is an annual call for projects. What do you need buses? Who needs buses? How much do you need? Significant increase in bus facility. I will note that as a part of bus facility, upgrades to buses, including contactless fare payment, real-time passenger information, are all eligible to be part of a grant request. That's part of the element. Again, I think it would simply, again, replant that seed where everyone wants to buy buses. But if you put forth a program where, listen, we're replacing old buses with new buses, and our plan is also to upgrade their fare collection, create better wayfinding, better real-time passenger information, a project that has those elements will score better than one that just simply says we need $3 million for a few buses. So sort of keep that in mind as you're putting your bus facility grants together. As I mentioned earlier, I think the real big winner in the transit world is those who support and advocate and push for low emission or no emission vehicles, electric buses. I remember the days when we would fight, transit agencies would fight for $75 million in low-no money. This program is authorized at $5.6 billion. I think one of the honest concerns is, can manufacturers keep up with dramatic increase in funding? That being said, there's a real push by Congress, and you're going to see a real push by the administration to see a vast turnover in transit fleets to low and no emission vehicles. So again, if low-no has been a program that, gee, we'd love to have electric buses, but we're a small transit agency and there's only $75 million available, you can kiss that excuse goodbye, because there will be billions of dollars available over the next 5 years for low and no emission buses. And again, same thing that holds here as it held in the other program. You can emphasize and up your opportunities or chances by adding ornaments to the tree. I spoke to a little bit on the FTA research program, so I'll just simply say keep on the eye that the head of the FTA research office, Karina Ricks, is an amazing spark plug. And that's the best way to describe her. So I expect great things to come out of FTA research, new opportunities. But again, they now know how much money they have over the next 5 years. So instead of cobbling together nickels from the couch cushions to create a new, research program, they can actually do something real here. So very excited what will come from FTA. And then finally, and I'll turn back over to Audrey, there is a new pilot program. It's a very small pilot program, but it's continued from the actual success of a research program, of an innovative coordinated access mobility program. This is really a new FTA program that's designed to create and develop new ways of creating and accessing individuals that have limitations, and also look at new ways of creating that demand response. So whether it's elderly and handicap access, getting veterans to their VA appointments, looking at more effective and efficient ways of doing that, rather than, in many cases, calling a cab to get someone to a healthcare appointment. So this is a small grant program. It's designed to create pilots. Again, I think it's very exciting. It was very successful the first iteration. So we look forward to new rounds of that. And with that, I will turn it back over to Audrey.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. So I want to spend the last 10 minutes here thinking about next steps, some ideas for innovation, as well as a quick wrap up. So in terms of key dates, once notices of funding are released, they're typically due 60 to 90 days later. So one thing to flag for you guys immediately is that the RAISE grant was announced. The notice of funding was made available in January of 22. So that, I believe, is due in mid-April. So definitely, if the RAISE grant is interesting, go and sort of think about an application for that. Then we're expecting the bus facility, the ATC-MTD, the infra, as well as the no-low to be announced this spring. And then more into the summer and the fall, looking to some of those programs that Jason walked through that are new. So the carbon emission reduction, congestion relief, safe streets for all, as well as those SMART grants. So very much looking forward to seeing through the timelines fall into place, and for there to be kind of a regular cadence of grants that will be available throughout the year to fund these different innovation programs that we've been talking about. So then I just want to reiterate some of the tips and tricks that Jason talked about throughout the presentation. So thinking about starting early and collaborating. So I think a great first step is attending webinars and understanding what's really out there and what's going to align the best to sort of the needs of your communities and your cities and regions. Really speaking to the grant and its purpose. So calling out what Jason was talking about earlier, that there are some kind of nuances between a lot of these different programs. So really thinking about which one is going to be the most in line with yours and your idea to kind of help promote success. Standing out, so not being afraid to add ornaments onto the tree like Jason was talking about. So including technology and different innovations in addition to some of the hard infrastructure to think about resiliency and sustainability and equity goals and how these different projects really speak to those goals and the ways that technology can be sort of supportive of that, as well as involving partners and stakeholders. So bringing everybody to the table, both on the public side as well as the private side, to pull together the strongest project possible. Jason, are there any tips and tricks that I missed?
No, you covered them.
Awesome. So then I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about a few ideas for potential innovation that could come under some of these different programs. One of those is advanced traffic control. And I think if we start at sort of the smallest level, thinking about how to make intersections more efficient to reduce congestion, as well as improve safety for vulnerable road users. So I think there's a variety of different pieces that come into that puzzle, like we've been talking about. So detection for being able to identify cars as well as pedestrians and bikes that are in the intersection, installing traffic controllers to help the efficient flow, as well as central management for those controllers, again, to help kind of keep all of the timing of the different controllers in sync in a way that helps to reduce congestion and maintain efficiency through the intersection, as well as adaptive traffic control. So automatically changing signals in a way that helps vulnerable road users to clear the intersection quickly, as well as changes signal timing depending on whether there are bicycles and pedestrians at the intersection or the number of cars that are at the intersection. So really taking advantage of machine learning and AI and other algorithms to help keep the city moving efficiently. And then a couple last pieces to talk about here is transit signal priority. So as we think about the multimodal network and how there are both buses and cars on the road network, installing transit priority that helps buses to keep to their schedules, as well as emergency vehicles to get green light priority, so that we make sure that that shared road use really supports the multimodal vision. And then finally, safety applications for vulnerable road users like pedestrians and bikers to make sure that they're able to clear the intersection safely, that we see them at the intersection, and that they're able to get to the other side both efficiently and safely. So a lot of different ways to think about both efficiency as well as safety at the intersection. And then for a couple of other ideas, I think that a lot of us are talking about back to transit. I'm a transit dependent rider, so this is definitely something very pertinent for me, and thinking about how we bring riders back, how we promote safety, as well as a better experience for users that's going to promote returning to transit. So I think a couple of pieces that come into that conversation is contactless experience. So we've seen users say that they'd be more comfortable returning to transit if they're able to use contactless payments, as well as if it's a little bit more seamless to be able to access the network. Mobile apps that helps to reduce some of the barriers of users selecting modes by helping them to do that journey planning and then accompanying them on their journeys, as well as nudging and rewards and really bringing that experience that users are familiar with at Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks, where they get rewards for buying coffee, applying a similar idea to the transit network, providing kind of rewards for using the network, as well as adding in kind of some incentives for behavioral change, such as ways to do peak management by rewarding users for traveling at different times, as well as to reward users for coming back to transit with sort of a number of stars that they can redeem for a coffee or a free ride. I think an extension of that conversation is thinking about mobility as a service and the way that we can start to tie together both the journey planning and the ticketing for the multimodal network. And I think that that is an evolution of bringing together different modes into a single journey. And again, bringing in some of the incentives and the nudging to help users to make decisions, like Jason was saying earlier, not just finding out that there's traffic on the network, but when you're sitting in traffic, but before you might make that journey and thinking about what some of the alternatives might be for those users. So mobility as a service, I definitely think is a way to improve flexibility in the network, as well as to kind of evolve the siloed modes in a city into a single mobility offering. And then finally, thinking about congestion management. So as cities are seeing traffic growing, especially as some users have seen traffic grow after COVID. So as users might not be going back to transit quite so quickly and might be opting for single occupancy vehicles, thinking about how we reduce congestion is a really pertinent part of this bill. And so I think one element is establishing a common operating system and operating picture to understand how the whole network is operating and providing decision support that allows for better response to incidents, both planned and unplanned events, and facilitating a playbook of actions that we can use to manage the network holistically. So I want to pause there to make sure that we have any time for a couple of questions, if there are any. But I want to just say my contact information is here. Please don't hesitate to reach out. And Cubic is here as a partner. We thank you guys for your time, for joining us today. And we are available for project ideation, for deeper dives into any of this information, as well as helping along the way for developing grants. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us, because we're really excited to collaborate and work with all of you. In terms of next steps, please keep an eye out. We're going to do a couple of shorter deep dive sessions into transit platform innovation and how this bill provides opportunities for grants for that type of investment. So with that, we're talking about contactless payment, journey planning, mobile evolution, all of those types of platform evolution, as well as a deep dive session on grants, or excuse me, on ITS grants. So I see that we have one question. Is there a website or portal, a one-stop shop that we can recommend that users or agencies proactively visit to ensure that they're aware of timelines? Jason, I believe that there's been a website set up by the White House, right, to kind of track key evolution?
Yes, there's a handful of in true government notion. There's actually a handful. So I will put one of the Federal Highways has one, and I put it in the chat, where they have an entire segment related to the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, which will include a variety of opportunities. And there is a Build Back Better. There's a guidebook as well that I will drop in the chat. But there is a federal website that I'm looking to find here that is in the White House. But yes, those two options right there that I put in the chat are two sites that I have pinned. For myself, just to take a look at what's there. I will say, I think it will not be a situation where the legislation itself, where a grant opportunity, you will not miss a grant opportunity. The White House is going to be very careful, or very sure to make sure that the opportunities are very public, and that there is plenty of opportunity for communities to know about it. And now I've stalled enough, and I have found the website itself, or the whitehouse.gov bipartisan infrastructure law. So I would say those three resources that I've put in the chat there are one guidebook and two websites that I have bookmarked myself.
Awesome. Any other questions? We are just about at time. Oh, great. Well, I really appreciate everybody's time today. This has been a really great deep dive session to talk about innovation and federal grants and what the new infrastructure bill really means for achieving some of these equity and sustainability and accessibility goals. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Again, we are here to work with you. So looking forward to starting that conversation, and we will share this recording as well as these slides with you as a resource. Thanks so much, everybody.
Take care.